Hello, history class. Welcome to our World War I, the Great War review. Let's go ahead and get started. So looking at PowerPoint question number 1, why did Germany implement the Schlieffen Plan even though they knew it would turn a regional conflict into a European-wide war? I thought you all had very good impressions on this first question. Certainly the mood and the atmosphere of Europe in the build-up to the First World War had convinced most of the major powers that a conflict was more or less inevitable. The heightened competition between nations and the rise of social Darwinism, as well as the global grab for colonies, was one side of this coin. The rising power of Russia and the declining power of the Ottoman Empire created an instability that, when it was combined with the alliance system, really ensured that any kind of regional conflict would eventually turn into a European-wide war. Therefore, Germany saw a true front war as pretty much inevitable once Russia and Austria and Hungary were pretty much engaged and were going to be engaging in a war with one another. And that really decided at that point in time that their best option would be to knock one of their opponents, in this case France, out of the conflict quickly. There were, of course, many flaws with this logic, including the fact that most of the German high command had convinced themselves that Britain would remain neutral, and it was really only the attack through Belgium which brought Great Britain into the conflict. And of course, in the end, this event proves very important because it becomes far easier for the Allied powers to place the blame on Germany following the war, as this is one of the main things that at least brought Great Britain into the war and sort of made it seem like Germany was the aggressor. Although, as I said, it's pretty hard to imagine that a European-wide war would not have broken out at this point in time with or without Germany invading France through Belgium, but it made it very easy after the war to pin the blame on them for that event. So, PowerPoint question number 2 here. Do you think the First World War could have been prevented, or was a European conflict inevitable? It can really be difficult to answer these kind of questions since they're pretty hypothetical. But, I thought you did a good job kind of trying to piece things together and play some sort of alternate history games. Most people kind of gauging the tensions within Europe and the hyper-nationalistic ideologies of the day really came to the conclusion that some form of conflict pretty much would likely have occurred. Still, the exact nature of the conflict and the force with which all the parties entered the war was certainly predicated upon the events surrounding the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And if you take that event out, it's very difficult to project in the future when a conflict would have occurred or how it would have come about or how it would have played out. It, of course, could have been very different had it been another 5, 10, 15 years down the road rather than when and where it occurred. PowerPoint question number 3. Why were so many European countries so eager for war in 1914? This is really a very multifaceted question. One reason was the buildup of nationalism in the countries and the very ethnocentric force that it took. All of the countries had really convinced themselves that their nation was the greatest nation on earth and that they were superior to all other nations for really years leading up to this conflict. And it's no wonder, therefore, that so many young men indoctrinated into this culture were eager for combat. I mean, it was in the school systems, it was in the culture and the society around them, it's in their pop culture. So it was very easy that these kind of young indoctrinated individuals were willing to go out and were very eager for this fight at the beginning, which, of course, went very much hand in hand with those aristocrats, military leaders, and people at the top who had been kind of gearing up for war for a long period of time. Also, there were often seems to have kind of been a real naivety among the young soldiers at the beginning of the conflict, and a tendency to see the war as some sort of an adventure, as kind of like a good excuse to take a free vacation, see lands away from home. No one really realized what kind of a conflict the First World War was ultimately going to turn out to be. These sentiments are really compounded by the fact that the experts in these countries did not understand the full effects of industrialized warfare and what that was going to mean. The prevailing thought at the time was that massive armies being put in the fields could not really sustain themselves for more than a few months, at which point one side or the other would simply run out of resources. The strategists really could have looked at examples such as the American Civil War or the Crimean War as examples indicating that a committed industrial nation could maintain a huge army for a sustained amount of time, but they did not do that. So most of the parties going into the First World War in the fall of 1914, kind of the prevailing opinion on all sides was that the conflict was likely to be over by Christmas, or at least by the next year. No one foresaw that this was going to stretch into such a long, bloody, drawn-out conflict. And a big part of that was that the technological innovations, which would give a decisive advantage to the defending parties in the war, and which were really going to grind the conflict to a halt, particularly on the Western Front. Inventions such as barbed wire, trench warfare, and especially the machine gun had really not yet been fully realized. And the end result of all this, of course, is that Europe entered the war very naive of the brutal and protracted conflict that was about to come. All right, PowerPoint question number 4. Given the lack of success, why did military commanders continue to launch such pointless and devastating attacks, and why did soldiers continue to charge? And the answer to this question really seems to be very much a result of how invested both sides ultimately become in the conflict. The longer the war continued, and the more that each side had sacrificed, the more they had lost, the more unimaginable it became to think of either side surrendering or negotiating or giving up the fight. It's not to say that it was a reasonable reason that they were thinking like this, but it certainly was one of the main factors that a more determined peace effort was never really pursued. Also, the fact that both sides had vested so much in demonizing their opponents made any chance of peace very much more difficult. Also, the commanders of the armies really never seemed to be able to wrap their head around the idea that war had become a war of attrition, and that the victor would eventually be the side that just simply lost the fewest men. Had they realized this, it would not have made much sense for the commanders to continue to order such large, costly, and ultimately ineffective attacks. And there really seems to have been a disconnect in general between the top military commanders on both sides of the conflict, who were often located miles away from the front, oftentimes living in relative comfort, and the soldiers on the ground who were enduring the squalid and dangerous conditions of the trenches and the fighting that was occurring. Of course, in the end, it did ultimately come down to a war of attrition, and it took the added manpower of the United States entering the conflict to really bring the war to an end. But up until the last days, neither side really seemed to have learned the lessons that the war was attempting to teach them. As far as the soldiers go, a lot of times they simply didn't have a choice. It was a choice of being shot by your opponents or being shot by your own officers. A lot of times that's the choice that was given to them. Of course, being incredibly vested in the conflict themselves, seeing so many of their friends and companions killed, it was very hard for them to imagine giving up the fight and simply ending it as well. But it's still important to note how brave these individuals were, realizing the kind of stakes they were up against, realizing the casualty rates that were occurring, and that so many of them did still, pick up their rifles and charge and try to make a difference in the conflict, even though it oftentimes, being on the offense, things were very much stacked against them. So I think that's a good place to stand with question number 4. Alright, so list some of the problems caused by the First World War. In the end, did this devastating conflict actually solve anything? From placing the blame of the war on Germany to the economic devastation that Europe was left in, to the decline of Europe as a world power in general, compared to the rise of the Soviet Union, the expansion of Imperial Japan, you really see most of the seeds that would eventually lead to the Second World War planted at the end of the First World War. The fact that the United States had decided to abandon the League of Nations and pretty much return to its kind of traditional policy of isolationism also contributes to this conflict. Finally, the devastating influenza pandemic, which began during the war, would go on to create the largest global health crisis, really, of the modern world. And really, a lot of people therefore view the First and Second World Wars as part of the same conflict, since the results of the First World War a lot of times lead directly into the Second World War. So something interesting to think about, that in certain cases you kind of almost view these two wars as kind of a continuation or a second kind of 30 years war, where even though there was a lull in the fighting, it's pretty hard to differentiate the two conflicts because of how much World War II is tied in with the results of the First World War. All right, moving on to our document exercises for this week. Question number 1, how did this poster or these posters simplify complex questions? Moving on, I have a copy of our posters lined up here. And first and foremost, I think it simplifies the very act of fighting in the war. If you look at the American soldiers, how they're smiling, their uniforms are clean, it gives a much different depiction than the life in the trenches, what the soldiers were ultimately getting into. The kind of war that the First World War ultimately was is certainly not being advertised here. All the soldiers seem to be very courageous and happy, and they don't have trench foot, so that they're really not advertising what kind of a war that the soldiers are ultimately getting into. Another very important simplification is support for the war in general. If you remember back to when the war started, there really wasn't a clear right or wrong side to this conflict. There were a lot of people in the United States, the majority people, I would say, in 1914, simply wanted to stay neutral. They didn't see that the United States had any role in the conflict, and especially once the conflict became as long and drawn out and bloody and devastating as it had become, more people were willing to sit back and let Europe kind of fight it out amongst themselves, and saw no real good reason for the United States to join the conflict. Once the United States ultimately does join the conflict, however, that means that the government, War Department, and those people who were in support of the war really had to find ways to drum up support for a conflict where there wasn't necessarily a lot of support for it in the first place. The Germans, there was the Zimmermann telegram, there was the sinking of the ships with the U-boats. There were certain things like that that could be perceived as attacks against the United States, but there wasn't a Pearl Harbor, right? There wasn't the sense that the Germans were actively attacking the United States. So the United States needed to find ways to try to get as much support for the war as they could. The easiest way for them to do this was to try to make the conflict into a black and white issue, right? Kind of take away the very convoluted nature of how the war first began, the fact that it really came down to all these different European powers vying with one another, and how the United States really in the beginning had no real clear side in it. Now that they had chosen a side, they really tried to make it a conflict of good versus evil, right? So you see the depictions of the Huns kind of committing war crimes, attacking women, being perceived with blood on their hands, being perceived as kind of monstrous figures that need to be destroyed. And part of the reason for this, why they're being depicted this way, is just because it'd be very easy for a lot of people not to have that association, since that's something that the War Department was essentially trying to create. Another example of really kind of simplifying complex question is this poster up here on the top left-hand corner, where you're seeing kind of the Army, the Navy, and labor all walking hand in hand together, right? This idea that everyone who is a labor in the United States should be contributing to the war effort and should be helping out. It should stop their union activities. Remember last week when we took a look at the document by Helen Keller, which was very critical of the war and really was asking labor to stand up against the war effort, right? So there's still a great questioning at this point in time. Labor, of course, is still being very much a lot of times underpaid, working in dangerous conditions. They're still trying to fight for some basic rights for workers, which is very much being undermined and undermanned during the First World War. But of course, they're trying to put out this propaganda to make workers feel like they are now being included in the same way that the Army is, and they are just as important to supplying the war effort, which in a lot of cases they were. But at the same time, it's essentially being used as a way to crush Union activity during the conflict as kind of a pretense for stamping out Unionism. All right, moving on to... Whoops. Go back here. 2.2. What emotions did these propaganda posters appeal to? Of course, an easy one is looking at it from patriotism. You see, the American flag with the soldier standing in front of it, kind of the Lady Liberty standing there, laying there in her red, white, and blue, the soldiers and their uniforms. Of course, in the other picture, you have kind of a tie-in with religion, right? With Pershing's crusade, this idea this is kind of a new adventure for American soldiers to go on. In a lot of ways, American soldiers are entering the First World War in the same way that the European powers entered the First World War, very naive of the kind of devastating, brutal, bleak combat that they were about to be entering into. And of course, the propaganda was more than willing to promote that idea. There's also, I'd say, appeal here to men's masculinity, right? Trying to shame them in some senses to even join the war. Trying to protect the women who are being attacked by the Germans, the Wake Up America poster, and of course this dandy over here on the top right, gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Of course, women at this point in time were not allowed to join the armed forces, but essentially trying to say that even if women would like to join the conflict, that men should be, have no excuse why they should not want to do it. It even says, be a man and do it right here. In a lot of cases, these propaganda posters aren't very subtle. Fear, of course, is another big one, right? This, the burning in the background, Wake Up America, and of course these various depictions of the Germans, and the idea that somehow if they were able to beat the British and the French, that America would somehow be under attack. But more than that, particularly if you take a look at this word, the Hun. The Hun is based upon kind of antiquity to a large degree, and the idea that the Huns were kind of a Central Asia nomadic group that attacked the Roman Empire, back in the 300s or so, and the idea that kind of Western civilization was under attack by this kind of foreign, barbaric enemy. The Germanic tribes from Germany in some cases had some relation to the Huns, but obviously this is thousands of years ago, and the current Germans had absolutely no relation to the Huns. And really, this idea was trying to play into another important aspect, which these propaganda posters are showing here, and that's the United States' perception of racism. Notice how each of the Germans here are depicted and are playing to very specific racial stereotypes. They're being depicted as black in color, they're being depicted as animalistic, and by labeling them Huns, you're essentially saying that these are non-white individuals that the United States is now going to fight against. So these propaganda posters are really playing into the racism of the United States at this point in time, and using that to stoke this fear, having them going after white women, and so forth, that are very prominent racial fears and stereotypes within the United States. They're using those now to apply those to the Germans, even though, of course, the Germans are just as white as the Americans were. Of course, Adolf Hitler has the idea of Germans as being the master race in the lead up to the World War II. Just another sense of how bizarre these ideas of social Darwinism had become at this point in time, where essentially all these different white countries in Europe were all accusing each other of being not white, of being less human, of being lesser on this evolutionary scale, even though it was all just people looking in the mirror saying that, hey, the person I'm seeing back at me is the person who should be at the top. And really all of those kind of stoked, I think, a lot of cases between the European powers and the United States to Europe, the fear and the hatred that was built up between these nations at this point in time, and the United States was certainly not above engaging in that. All right, and finally looking at Theodore Roosevelt's statement here. Who did Roosevelt believe threatened the United States during World War I? And essentially, Roosevelt really feels that it's anyone who is critical to the war effort, not just Germans, not just German Americans, but anyone who is not 100% on board supporting the First World War. And he, of course, isn't alone. There's plenty of people who are siding with him. There's plenty of people from the government who are enacting these laws that are really trying to stamp out any kind of dissent. This is part of this move towards total war, right? This idea that the nation, in order to support a conflict like the First World War, needs to be 100% totally committed, and that any dissent is very forcefully cracked down upon, to the point at which Roosevelt is pretty much saying that anyone who is not in support of the war should be detained, incarcerated, put in a concentration camp. Some pretty scary ideas that the United States starts toying around with here during the First World War. As I said, it wasn't just Germans, it was German Americans, it was pacifists, people who opposed the war on religious grounds, or people who just, really weren't swayed by the propaganda and realized that, hey, this really isn't the United States conflict to get involved with. Immigrants, he goes after immigrants. It's the funny part where he starts pointing the finger at the Irish, like the Irish don't like the British, so they're going to start trying to undermine the war effort. Politicians who haven't been strong or forceful enough in their support of the war effort, and of course labor as well, looking at the IWW and saying, anyone who is questioning kind of undivided loyalty, not just to the United States, but to kind of the corporate structure, is also should also be targeted in this process. And as I said, a lot of people end up backing this up. And I think part of this is, like I said, the dedication that the United States wanted to enforce towards the idea of total war. Part of it was because it was a very ambiguous kind of conflict to begin with, and that they needed to find ways to ensure support for the conflict from America's citizens, where there might not necessarily have been a clear, rational reason for the United States to join or get involved in the war. As well as you can just see kind of the racial and kind of ethnocentric tensions, as well as, I'd say, economic tensions that existed within the United States being brought out here. That anyone who kind of Theodore Roosevelt didn't like to begin with, he was going to start accusing as being anti or against the war. And in some cases, it's really kind of what Helen Keller was warning the country about in her letter last week, right? The fact that essentially the United States government was trying to engage in this conflict, not because it was in the best interest of the United States, but because it was in the best interest of a few individuals. And of course, it was going to be people like Helen Keller that Roosevelt here is attacking and going after. All right, that is our review for this week. I hope you found it informative. Of course, as always, if you have any questions about me, about the documents, about your grades, feel free to let me know. Thank you very much, and have a nice week.